We are discussing some interesting material from Reza Aslan's book, Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. Reza is a Muslim. He defends Muhammad in various ways. He'd be a little towards the liberal end of the spectrum. He's not a Salafi, and he's kind of liberal with the way he interprets the Muslim sources. We'll be discussing that on a different program. But we want to look at what Reza says about the resurrection of Jesus. Mike, are you there with us?
Sure am.
Just to give us an idea, because Reza talks about this a bit, was Jesus the only person who claimed to be the Messiah way back in his time?
No, there were quite a few of them.
Now, if your Messiah happened to die, and many of these people claiming to be the Messiah did die, if your Messiah died, what are you going to do after that?
Well, you typically found another Messiah or you went home.
And that's interesting because that's exactly what Reza said. This is why I said this is refreshing. He says a lot that's just common sense, and it is based on historical understanding. Let me go ahead and read a paragraph, and then we'll get into what he's going to say about the resurrection. He says, the disciples faced a profound test of faith after Jesus' death. The crucifixion marked the end of their dream of overturning the existing system, of reconstituting the 12 tribes of Israel and ruling over them in God's name. That's the part we might disagree with, that they were planning on establishing an earthly kingdom, which is what Reza believes. But he's right about this. He says, the kingdom of God would not be established on earth as Jesus had promised. The meek and the poor would not exchange places with the rich and the powerful. So if this is what the disciples were hoping, then their hopes were crushed. So the Roman occupation would not be overthrown. As with the followers of every other Messiah the empire had killed, there was nothing left for Jesus' disciples to do but abandon their cause, renounce their revolutionary activities, and return to their farms and villages. And generally, if you're following one of those false messiahs and he gets crucified by the Romans, that's pretty much all you're left with, right?
That's correct.
You've had public debates with Muslims and with general non-theists, including some very high-level scholars on this issue, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure.
All right. Now what I think is really cool is a lot of what Reza presents is the sort of material that Christians would use in building a historical case for the resurrection of Jesus, and a lot of what he says is what convinced me to become a Christian. And so some of this material is what started bothering me a lot when I was an atheist and got me really thinking, and ultimately had a lot to do with me accepting the gospel. Now, let me share with you where he's going here. So, Jesus' disciples had nothing to do but go home. People who follow false messiahs have nothing to do but go home and start working again or find another messiah. But he says, then something extraordinary happened. What exactly that something was is impossible to know. Jesus' resurrection is an exceedingly difficult topic for the historian to discuss, not least because it falls beyond the scope of any examination of the historical Jesus. Obviously, the notion of a man dying a gruesome death and returning to life 3 days later defies all logic, reason, and sense. One could simply stop the argument there, dismiss the resurrection as a lie, and declare belief in the risen Jesus to be the product of a deludible mind. Now, it's interesting what he does here. He says the resurrection defies all logic, reason, and sense. And it certainly doesn't defy logic. There's no contradiction involved in saying, Jesus rose from the dead. As far as defying reason and sense, it would only defy reason and sense if you don't believe that in miracles, you don't believe in the supernatural world, you don't believe that there's a being who can perform miracles. That's the only way that something like the resurrection could defy reason and sense. If there is no God, if there is no one capable of resurrecting the dead. But here's where he goes. Because I'm saying this because that was my thoughts on the resurrection before I believed in the resurrection. This is just absolute nonsense here. And here's the problem. He says, however, there is this nagging fact to consider. One after another of those who claim to have witnessed the risen Jesus went to their own gruesome deaths, refusing to recant their testimony. That is not in itself unusual. Many zealous Jews died horribly for refusing to deny their beliefs. But these first followers of Jesus were not being asked to reject matters of faith based on events that took place centuries, if not millennia before. They were being asked to deny something they themselves personally, directly encountered. And why this is interesting is, Mike, what's the scholarly, let's say, consensus on the disciples' belief that they had seen Jesus? I mean, we have Christian scholars, we have atheist scholars, we have agnostic scholars, and even in the Christian spectrum, you have your conservative, your liberals, and so on. What do scholars think about the appearances? What do they think that happened with the disciples?
Well, those who comment on it, there's virtually a 100% consensus that the disciples had experiences in individual and in group settings that they perceived and sincerely believed was the risen Jesus who had appeared to them.
And that would have a lot to do with what Reza was talking about here, namely that they're willing to go to their deaths for what they claim to have seen.
That's correct. Virtually 100% who comment on it.
So you're talking even agnostics and atheists here will say, now obviously, obviously they don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead, but they will say, look, the disciples believed that they had seen Jesus risen from the dead.
That's correct. Liberal, moderate, of course conservative, agnostic, atheist, Jewish scholars, virtually 100% who comment on the resurrection would say that these disciples had experiences in which they believed Jesus rose and appeared to them.
And why I found this very, interesting is this is the thing beyond anything else that started bothering me about Christianity. I had always believed that that the disciples, this was my theory. This was my theory. It wasn't well researched, but my theory was Jesus died. The guy that the disciples believed in, their Messiah, died, and they wanted to keep his message going, so they invented the story about his resurrection from the dead to keep things going. They didn't want to go home and return to what they were doing. They wanted to keep his teachings alive. And then it's with the deaths. It's with the deaths. These guys being willing to die. I tried to think of anyone in history that knowingly died for something that they knew wasn't true. In other words, as Reza pointed out, lots of people die. Lots of people die, but they're dying for things that they heard from someone, things that are based on things that happened in the remote past. Like we believe in Christianity. I would lay my life down, right? If the sword's at my neck, I'm thinking I'm not gonna recant Christianity. But even me, even us today, we'd be laying down our lives for a message that we heard and we believed in. And there are people around the world today and down through history who've been willing to lay down their lives for something they believe in. There are Muslims right now dying in Syria. They believe completely in what they're dying for. But there's, as Aslan points out, there's a huge difference between that and what was going on with the disciples. Muslims who are dying in Syria, Christians who are refusing to convert to Islam and are being killed, all of these people believe in what they're dying for, but that's the key. You're not going to lay your life down for it if you don't believe in it. I'm not going to say, right, hey, I'm going to go to Syria. I don't believe in Islam, but I'm going to go to Syria and fight jihad and lay down my life for Muhammad. I don't believe in Muhammad, so I'm not going to lay down my life for Muhammad. If someone's not a Christian, they're not going to lay their life down for the gospel. These men were laying their lives down for the gospel, and this included something they claimed to have seen. They had seen Jesus risen from the dead. This is what they would not recant, that Jesus is Lord, and that he is risen from the dead. And they claimed to witness this with their own lives. What other explanation could there be than that they actually saw something? The point is, they're not making this up. They saw something, and that's why even non-Christian scholars will say, yeah, they saw something. Don't know what it was. Maybe it's a hallucination, whatever it is. But they saw something. That's the general idea, Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they think they're confident. I mean, there's really good reason, because all the accounts we have that that discuss it talk about this. I mean, first you've got Paul. He says he saw the risen Jesus. Paul said that he was preaching the same thing as the Jerusalem apostles were preaching, that he'd gone up to Jerusalem, Galatians 2, and that's one of Paul's undisputed letters. In other words, of the 13 letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament, there are 7 that are undisputedly written by Paul. Scholars then, debate over the other 6, and some are more certain than others. But just from Paul's undisputed letters, we can know that Paul said that he met with the Jerusalem apostles, Peter, James, and John, the leaders of the Jerusalem church, ran the gospel message he'd been preaching past them to make sure he was preaching what they were preaching, that they certified what he was preaching was true. That's Paul's account. And then you've got people like Clement of Rome and Polycarp, who were probably discipled by the apostles Peter and John respectively, and they are writing after the death of Paul, and they mention Paul in very laudatory terms. You have Clement of Rome, who places Paul on par with his mentor Peter. And then you've got Polycarp, who quotes Paul's letters twice and refers to them as part of the sacred scriptures. And he also says that Paul, and I quote, accurately and reliably taught the message of truth. Now, these aren't the kinds of things you say about Paul if he's teaching differently than what your mentors Peter and John were teaching. But they're precisely the kinds of things you say about Paul if he was teaching what the Jerusalem apostles were teaching, when it came at least to the gospel message. And that involved Jesus' death, his atoning death, the belief that he was divine, and his resurrection from the dead. So we can know that when we hear Paul on this gospel message, we are also hearing the voice of the Jerusalem apostles. This is what they were proclaiming. Jesus had been raised bodily from the dead.
And I like tying it in with Paul, because a lot of Reza's book is focused on the gospel material. And one of the reasons I really liked what his discussion is that several times in his book, Reza is saying something, and I think of an objection. I think, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't know about such and such. And then in the very next paragraph, he'll start talking about the such and such that I think he doesn't know about. And this passage on the resurrection is one of those passages. Let me start it off, and I'll tell you my thought process as I was going along. He says, although the first resurrection stories were not written until the mid to late 90s, he says there is no resurrection appearance in either the Q source materials compiled in 50 CE or in the Gospel of Mark written after 70 CE.
Hang on a second. Yeah, there's no resurrection narrative in the hypothetical Q source, but there's no mention of Jesus' death in it either.
Yeah, that's considered a sayings document, right? It was a collection of sayings, right?
That's correct, and we have no idea what it was. It could have been some notes that the disciples carried around with them, teachings of Jesus, so that when they were going around, these were the notes they referred to. We just don't know what Q was. It's an entirely hypothetical source, and to go beyond that and trying to say, well, this is definitely, there was this Q community and redacted levels of Q. I mean, that is just positing castles in the air. There's just that's just pure speculation. We don't know anything other than there appears to have been a source that Matthew and Luke used on occasion.
And I'm glad you actually jumped in there, because that's immediately what I did when I was reading this. Right when he said that, I thought, Q, if we don't actually have Q. What we know about is it seems to be a sayings document. That's very different from the resurrection appearances or something like that. But then I think
if these were notes that the disciples were carrying around with them, Q might have been a source that was there during the ministry of Jesus. Mm-hmm. So that's why it wouldn't mention his death or resurrection. So we just don't know much about Q.
Yeah, and then to say, and there's no resurrection appearance in the Gospel of Mark. Well, the Gospel of Mark ends with saying, go see Jesus where he told you to, right?
That's correct. And I would point out that there are numerous times in Mark's Gospel where Jesus predicts his death and his resurrection. So Mark certainly knows about it. In fact, in Mark chapter 14, verse 28, he says, after he tells his disciples that after he rises from the dead, they are to go to Galilee, and there he will meet them. And that's why the angel later on in Mark chapter 16, verse 7 says, Jesus is raised now. Go ahead into Galilee, and you'll see him there just as he told you. So, but his death and resurrection are mentioned in Mark chapter 8, verse 33, Mark 9, 31 through 33. I mean, it's all throughout Mark's gospel. So Jesus is predicting his death and resurrection throughout Mark's gospel. The angel says he's raised from the dead for them to go to Galilee where they will see him. I personally think that the ending of Mark was lost. That may not be the case, but we don't know for sure. But even if it were meant to end at chapter 16, verse 8, surely Mark is familiar with the resurrection because, again, Jesus predicts it and the angel announces it.
Yeah. So Mark doesn't include examples of the appearances to the other apostles and so on. That doesn't mean there's no resurrection there in the Gospel of Mark. So as I'm reading this, I read although the first resurrection stories were not written until the mid to late 90s, I'm thinking, okay, putting Matthew and Luke in the mid to late 90s. So he's not just saying 90 anymore, he's saying between 95 and 100. That's much later than I would put them. He says, so Matthew and Luke he's putting at the end of the first century. Then he says, it's not in the Q material, which is a sayings document. It's not talking about the resurrection. And it's not in the Gospel of Mark. It looks like he's deliberately trying to misrepresent the facts and try to make it look like that the resurrection story came much later. It wasn't in the early material. It only comes along later, and therefore someone invented it. That's what I'm thinking as I'm reading it, but then I keep reading. And he says, belief in the resurrection seems to have been part of the earliest liturgical formula of the nascent Christian community. Paul, the former Pharisee who would become the most influential interpreter of Jesus' message, writes about the resurrection in a letter addressed to the Christian community in the Greek city of Corinth sometime around 50 CE. For I give over to you, this is a quotation from Paul, I'll tell you when I'm done, everyone. For I give over to you the first things which I myself accepted, that Christ died for the sake of our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he rose again on the third day according to the Scriptures, that he was seen by Cephas, Simon Peter, then by the 12. After that he was seen by over 500 brothers at once, many of whom are still alive, though some have died. After that he was seen by his brother James, then by all the apostles, and last of all he was seen by me as well. So so I'm reading that, and if Reza is talking about the Q source, which he puts around 50, or Mark, which he puts after 70, here you're talking Paul writing in Corinthians around 50, but there's something much more interesting about this passage. Now this was written around 50, according to Reza. But then he says this, Paul may have written those words in 50 CE, but he is repeating what is likely a much older formula, one that may be traced to the early 40s. That means belief in the resurrection of Jesus was among the community's first attestations of faith, earlier than the Passion narratives, earlier even than the story of the virgin birth. So Reza here is saying we have some very early material. Mike, you there?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
There we go.
Yeah, I'm here.
So what do you think about this creed in 1 Corinthians 15?
Well, it's, Reza is correct that this is very early tradition here. In fact, this is something that is accepted by a consensus of historical Jesus scholars or New Testament scholars. You've got 1 Corinthians, I'd say, was written probably around the year 55, probably closer to the middle of that decade than the earlier part. But Paul has established a church in Corinth there around the year 50, 51. And when he's saying he wants to remind them of the gospel he had preached to them, this is chapter 15, verse 1. He's talking about the gospel he preached to them when he established the church there in 50 or 51. And then he says, hey, I delivered to you then, back in 50-51, what I had also received. So he's, this is oral tradition that he's passing along to them. And there are a number of things in this creed that suggest it's oral tradition. The delivered and received are two technical terms for the imparting of oral tradition. You've got the fact that there's parallelism here. That's long, short, long, short. Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared. So you got long, short, long, short. You've got the fact that Paul introduces this in verse 1 by saying he wants to remind them of the gospel he had preached to them and in which they'd become Christians. Well, remember, according to Galatians 2, just a few years before that, it could have been as little as 1 year before he established the church in Corinth, that he got the gospel certified that he had been preaching. He got it certified by the Jerusalem apostles, Peter, James, and John. So, you'd look and you say, wow, well, this message that he passed by them and he got certified to be accurate to what they were preaching, wow, if we only had this written down somewhere, that'd be great. Well, we do right here. Paul says, I want to remind you of the gospel message I preached to you. And then he gives a summary of that in verses 3 through 7. That talks about the death, the resurrection, and appearances of Jesus, post-resurrection appearances of Jesus to them, to individuals and to groups, and even to Paul, an enemy of the church. Right after that, in verse 11, he says, hey, whether I am doing it or the apostles are doing it, this is what we preach and what you believed. And when he uses the term preach, it's a different one than he uses in verse 1. The one he uses in verse 1 is euangelizomai, which means to bring them good news. But in verse 11, verse 12, and verse 14, he uses the term keruso or kerygma. So this is the official and formal proclamation of the disciples. So this thing has every mark of being oral tradition. And because Paul had run the gospel message past the Jerusalem apostles and got it certified with them, what he was preaching when it came to the gospel message, at least, is what they were preaching. And this is the gospel message, an outline of it that he gives us in verses 3 through 7. So not only does this go back to the 40s, David and Sam, this goes back to the Jerusalem apostles themselves. When we are reading verses 3 through 7, we are actually hearing the voice of the Jerusalem apostles. This is just amazing, because despite the fact that, there is some question concerning the authorship of some of the Gospels, of what we are reading in chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians can go back to the Jerusalem apostles. We can establish this with historical certainty. This is just the kind of stuff historians drool over. I like to look at it like of a deck of cards. If the Gospels, we have some cards that they have greater value than others. So if we look at the Gospels, I mean no disrespect to them. I'm not talking about their divine inspiration. I'm thinking about them as historical sources and the certitude with which we can, identify a lot of things in them. If we look at the four Gospels as tens or jacks, with Paul, we've got an ace, because this is a guy that we can trace back to he claims to be an eyewitness of the risen Jesus himself. We can go right back to the Jerusalem apostles through Paul, certifiably through him, and he was hostile at the time of his conversion experience. So, this is just great stuff. He is an ace in terms of a historical source.
Now, Mike, if Paul is an ace, I have to say that Reza Aslan is a joker, because after going through all that material, he concludes by saying, nevertheless, the fact remains that the resurrection is not a historical event. It may have had historical ripples, but the event itself falls outside the scope of history and into the realm of faith. It is, in fact, the ultimate test of faith for Christians. As Paul wrote in that same letter to the Corinthians, if Christ has not been risen, then our preaching is empty and your faith is in vain. 1 Corinthians 15:17. So what we have, and this is from Reza himself, we have very early material. In fact, we hear on, from internet atheists and so on that the resurrection story came very late. No, we know that it was there from the very beginning, and Reza admits that this is very early. This isn't. We don't just have the reports. We know that the apostles believed this, and they were convinced that Jesus had appeared to them. So Reza admits that Jesus died. He admits that the disciples were going to their deaths, proclaiming that they had seen him. And he points out that there's a huge difference between what these apostles were doing and what other people are doing when they die for something that they believe in. If the apostles were dying for something they claim to have seen. Now, it seems to me that all you need for Jesus rising from the dead is he was dead and then he was alive. So he's dead and he was alive. But both of those, if he's dead, that's something we can investigate historically. And if he's alive again later, that's something we can investigate historically. So to say that the resurrection is not a historical event, it may have had historical ripples, but the event itself falls outside the scope of history and into the realm of faith. Well, I agree if he's, if what he means by the resurrection is outside the scope of history, if he means, well, we weren't there, we didn't see it, or something like that, or that you can't see the miraculous intervention of God there, something like that, that the historian can't do that. Well, maybe. But when he says, therefore, it's just in the realm of faith, I think he's dismissing too good a case, one that he admits all the elements for. In other words, a lot of the information he's presented here is the information I would present to someone and say, therefore, believe the resurrection. Reza presents all the information and then says, but it's just a matter of faith. But we'd have to say that this is a faith that is grounded in a lot of good evidence. The evidence that we have, even the information that Reza has presented, just doesn't make sense in light of something other than the resurrection. In other words, if Jesus didn't rise or anything else happened, the evidence we have wouldn't make sense.